The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first act in United States history to refuse admittance to members of a specific nationality or ethnic group. Its goals were to prevent the immigration of Chinese workers for 10 years and deny naturalization to Chinese immigrants already in America. Under the act, Chinese immigrant laborers were blamed for declining wages and job opportunities. They also faced violence, social isolation, and a series of discriminatory laws. The Act's origins date back to 1848, when gold was discovered in California. After this discovery, the mining industry looked to California for workers. Cheap transportation, a willingness to undergo dangerous jobs for low pay, and a strong work ethic helped the Chinese people's case for immigrant labor. In 1852, 20,000 Chinese arrived in California and became an important part of the labor force. Chinese immigration labor in America had an auspicious start. The immigrants were well liked and were treated with justice and respect. This positive relationship between the Americans and the Chinese sparked the Burlingame Treaty of 1868, which guaranteed the inherent and inalienable right of man to change his home and allegiance, and also the mutual advantage of the free migration and emigration of their citizens and subjects from one country to the other for purposes of curiosity, trade, or as permanent residence. After the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the situation began to change for the worse. White population grew in the West and competition for jobs increased, which is when white hostility towards the Chinese began. In the Panic of 1873, wages were suppressed due to wild swings in gold prices, and trade unions of white workers blamed low cost Chinese laborers for this decline. Furthermore, 23 Chinese were murdered during riots in Los Angeles and San Francisco in the 1870s, led by Irish American businessman Dennis Kearney, who was an immigrant himself. In 1880, the United States discussed a treaty with China which would restrict immigration for laborers, but would exempt foreign travelers, students, teachers, and merchants. With the new treaty established, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act on May 6, 1882. Chinese American citizens throughout the West began to suffer from the act. This can be seen in the example of Che Chan Ping, an unskilled laborer living in San Francisco, California. He worked for about 12 years before returning to China in 1887. Before leaving, he obtained a customs certificate that would permit him to return to the United States. Meanwhile, on October 1st, 1888, Congress amended the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act with the Scott Act, which stipulated a complete prohibition on the re-entry of all Chinese laborers who left the country, even if they had legal certificates to return. When Che Chan-ping arrived at the San Francisco port on October 8, 1888, Customs House officials refused his request to land because of the Scott Act. Ping appealed to the Federal District Court in California, but he was ultimately unsuccessful. The Supreme Court agreed to review the case afterwards. The Scott Act contradicted rights guaranteed to Chinese visitors in the 1868 Burlingame Treaty and the 1880 treaty regulating immigration from China, but the Supreme Court unanimously upheld the decision of the lower court regardless. Justice Stephen J. Field wrote that the federal government had the right to exercise the right to exclude foreigners at any time when, in the judgment of the government, the interests of the country require it. The same Supreme Court justice also heard the case of another Chinese immigrant, Chu Hyong. Chu Hyong had come to the United States sometime before November 1880, but had left his town of San Francisco for Honolulu in June 1881. This was before the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed and before return certificates became available. He returned to the San Francisco area on September 22, 1884, applying for admission as a prior resident of the city. Because he did not have the certificate, he was denied permission to return. In response, he brought his denial to the U.S. Circuit Court for the District of California. Frustrated by the failure of the 1882 Act to meet their expectations, exclusionists in Congress amended the law in 1884 in an attempt to close the perceived loopholes. The 1884 law specified that the return certificates were to be the only evidence permissible of a Chinese laborer's right to enter the United States. Field's earlier statement proves the court's radical logic towards the decision on the amendment of the 1882 Act. During Hyung's hearing, Justice Stephen J. Field questions what shall become of the Chinese laborers. Field explains that Chinese immigrants coming into America must have the obligation to stay or vacate and return to China. Federal law provided that the opinion of the presiding Supreme Court justice prevailed in the Circuit Court, although a divided opinion could be appealed to the Supreme Court, and Chu Hyung filed an appeal. Hyung's perseverance displays the value of freedom that America at the time was solely devoid of. Field's decision was approved in the court of popular opinion as one San Francisco newspaper declared that the decision showed how unjustly the people of California have judged Mr. Justice Field with references to the Chinese question. But when the Supreme Court heard the case, Field found himself reversed in a 7-2 decision. Unless Congress clearly and unmistakably expressed its intent to violate the treaty, the court was obliged under the Constitution and rules of construction to try to reconcile the statute with the treaty. This could easily be done, said Justice John Marshall Harlan. Field acknowledged the authority of treaties but stressed they were no more binding than federal statutes. Congress clearly intended in the Act of 1884 to close a door opened by the federal courts in their earlier decisions. It was the duty of the Supreme Court, he admonished, to be the servant of the law, bound to obey, not to evade or make it. On the day after the Circuit Court's decision in Chu-Hyong, Field authored another opinion, this time unanimous, holding that children born in the United States of Chinese parents were American citizens and exempt from the exclusion law. Chu-Hyong's push for Chinese American rights have succeeded in the court, allowing native-born Chinese Americans the freedom from the Exclusion Act. This decision, as well as the Chu-Hyong opinion, provided another opening for Chinese and expanded litigation in the federal courts as both Chinese claiming birthright citizenship and laborers asserting prior residency sought to establish their right to enter the United States. The battle over exclusion was not over. Buoyed by their successes in cases like Chu-Hyong, Chinese in the United States continued to see the federal courts as potential allies, however reluctant. This became prevalent and appears in the case of Wong Kim Ark's trial. Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco in 1873 of Chinese parents who were domiciled residents of the United States, earning a living as merchants. Wong spent his entire childhood in the United States. In 1890, he went to China for a temporary visit and returned the following year. Though the 1882 Exclusion Act and its 1884 amendment, as well as the 1888 Scott Act and the 1892 Geary Act, laws that barred the entry of Chinese laborers, were in effect, the collector of customs at the port of San Francisco, who was responsible for enforcing these Chinese exclusion laws, allowed Wong to land because he was a native-born American citizen. However, when Wong visited China a second time in 1894, he was denied re-entry upon his return in 1895. His lawyer, Thomas Reardon, filed a writ of habeas corpus on his behalf and his case was heard in the District Court for the Northern District of California. Because Wong Kim Ark has been a Chinese person, he was not exempt from the provisions of the exclusion laws, as were Chinese merchants, students, diplomats, and temporary visitors, who were still allowed entry after 1882. Wong Kim Ark's case was carefully reviewed by the Supreme Court. The decision carried afterwards stated that neither the Chinese exclusion laws nor earlier court rulings denying Chinese the right of naturalization applied to Wong Kim Ark. The court's decision prompted the use of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, an amendment which, as described by the justices, an amendment that was intended to bring all races, without distinction of color, within the rule which prior to that time pertained to the white race. Even though Congress, various state legislatures, and some lower courts had denied persons of Chinese ancestry many rights, these key trials presented took a stand against the attempt to abrogate the birthright citizenship of Chinese Americans, thereby protecting the civil rights of everyone. The Chinese Exclusion Act has had a lasting effect on the country's legal history. The Geary Act of 1892 followed, prolonging the effects of the Exclusion Act for another 10 years. The immigration ban on Chinese laborers was then made permanent in 1902. This continued until finally, in 1943, the Exclusion Act was repealed for good. Today, people of all races and ethnicities, including Chinese, can immigrate to and coexist in the United States peacefully, thanks to the individuals who took a stand against this discriminatory law.